Cora Mae Whitfield was 41 years old and had exactly $14 to her name when the sheriff nailed the eviction notice to her own front door. It was her late husband's brother, acting on behalf of the Vance and Pruitt Trust Company, who signed the paper that put her out of the only home she had ever kept, a modest dairy farm on Miller's Creek, Montana Territory, built board by her husband Daniel before the fever took him 3 winters past. With her $14 folded twice inside her glove, she walked past the courthouse steps in the town of Sparrow Falls and saw a notice for a bank auction. An old, forgotten ice house on the edge of the creek, abandoned since the railroad brought machine-made ice and put the ice-cutting trade to its grave. The bidding opened at $9. No one else raised a hand. She paid every cent she dared and walked away, owning a leaning, frost-bitten shed that smelled of sawdust and rot, a purchase so foolish that the auctioneer laughed under his breath as he signed the deed over to her. But beneath the ancient ice, packed in sawdust that had not been disturbed in a generation, something had been waiting through those forgotten years, a secret sealed in lead and silence that would soon unravel the true history of Sparrow Falls and put right a wrong that had shadowed the whole valley for 20 years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Cora Mae Whitfield. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Cora Mae had been born Cora Mae Doyle in 1845 in a sod house on the eastern plains of Nebraska Territory, the third of 6 children to a father who broke horses for the army and a mother who kept bees, sewed quilts, and could stretch a single ham through a whole winter without anyone going hungry. It was from her mother, Ruth Doyle, that Cora Mae learned the quiet, stubborn art of making something out of nothing, how to boil down scraps of tallow into good soap, how to read the sky for weather a full day before it came, how to keep a ledger of every egg, every bolt of cloth, every debt owed and paid, in a hand so neat the county assessor once remarked it was finer than his own clerk's. Her father taught her something else, something that would matter more than she ever imagined. On the day the ice cracked open beneath her hands, he taught her never to judge the worth of a thing, a horse, a tool, a person, by its condition on the outside. "The finest horse I ever broke," he used to say, working a currycomb through the ribs of some sorry, sway-backed creature nobody else wanted, looked like she wasn't worth the rope to lead her to slaughter. Folks are lazy readers, Cora Mae. They read the cover and call it the whole book. She carried that lesson through her girlhood, the way other girls carried a locket. She married Daniel Whitfield in the spring of 1868, when she was 23, in a ceremony held in the yard of the little Lutheran church outside Ogallala, with wildflowers woven through her hair because there had been no money for lace. Daniel was a quiet, broad-shouldered man with sun-cracked hands and a laugh that came rare but full when it came, a man who had walked west from Ohio with nothing but a rifle, a Bible, and a plan to build something that would outlast him. Together they filed a claim on 160 acres along Miller's Creek in the Montana Territory, in a valley cupped by cottonwoods and framed by the blue shoulders of the Bridger Range, and they built a life there, stone by stone and season by season. Cora Mae kept dairy cows, 6 of them at the height of their prosperity, and her butter and cheese were known through 3 counties for a richness that no one else's could match, a secret she kept close and never wrote down, passed only in the movement of her hands. Daniel farmed wheat and ran a small herd of cattle, and though the winters were hard and the summers harder, by 1880 they had a solid clapboard house, a red barn, 2 children, a son, Wyatt, and a daughter, Iris, and the beginnings of a name in the valley as people who could be trusted, who paid what they owed, and helped when a neighbor's roof caved or a neighbor's baby came early. It was in those years that Cora Mae first came to know the town of Sparrow Falls proper, a modest crossroads settlement of perhaps 400 souls that had grown up around a grist mill and a trading post, then a church, then a schoolhouse, then, in 1874, a bank. The Vance and Pruitt Trust Company was founded by 2 men, Elias Vance and Thomas Pruitt. who arrived from the east with capital, confidence, and an easy charm that won over half the valley before anyone thought to ask too many questions. Elias Vance in particular had a gift for remembering names, for standing godfather to babies, for loaning money at the exact moment a farmer's crop failed, and gratitude ran deepest. Cora Mae remembered him from her own girlhood visits to town, remembered how her father, a plain and careful man, had never once done business with Vance, though he was polite enough to tip his hat. "That man smiles with his mouth open too wide," her father had said once, watching Vance work a crowd outside the mercantile, "like he's already counting your teeth." Cora Mae had laughed at the time. She would remember the remark very differently, many years later, standing in the frozen dark of an abandoned ice house, with a lantern in one trembling hand. For a decade, the Whitfield farm prospered modestly, and Cora Mae believed, as most people believe in the fat years, that this steady life was simply what life was, that hardship, when it came, would be weather, not treachery. She was wrong, though the truth of it would take her years and a great deal of grief to uncover. The unraveling began in the winter of 1883, when a fever swept through the valley on the heels of an early and brutal cold snap. It took the very old and the very young first, and then, with a cruelty Cora Mae never fully made peace with, it took Daniel, a man in the prime of his life, 40 years old, strong as a young ox, felled in 11 days by an illness the town doctor could not name and could not stop. Cora Mae nursed him herself, boiling willow bark and onion poultices through nights so cold the water froze in the basin before morning, and when he died in the gray hour before dawn on the 12th day of February, she was left a widow of 38 with 2 children, a farm, 6 cows, and a debt she had not known the full size of until the paperwork was laid before her. Daniel, it turned out, had taken a note against the farm 2 years before his death, a modest loan of $300 from the Vance and Pruitt Trust Company to buy a new mowing machine and see the family through a lean season, secured, as was common practice, against the deed to the land itself. He had always meant to pay it down quickly, and had paid down a good portion of it, but his death left the balance outstanding, and the note, Cora Mae discovered only after his funeral, contained a clause she had never been shown, an acceleration clause, in dense legal script, that allowed the bank to call the entire remaining balance due immediately upon the death of the primary signer, rather than allow the widow the customary grace period every other lender in the territory extended as a matter of decency. She went to the bank herself, dressed in her mourning black, her children's hands in hers, and asked Elias Vance for time. He was, she remembered, extraordinarily gentle with her that day, so gentle that it took her weeks to understand what his gentleness had actually cost her. He patted her hand across his broad mahogany desk and told her that his hands, sadly, were tied by the terms of the note, that he personally wished it could be otherwise, that perhaps, if she could raise even half the balance within 90 days, something might be arranged. She spent those 90 days selling what she could, the cows, one by one, the good china her mother had shipped from Nebraska, Daniel's rifle, even her wedding ring for a time, though a kind neighbor bought it and quietly returned it to her a year later, and still fell $40 short. On the 91st day, the sheriff came with the eviction paper, and Elias Vance did not come himself. He sent his brother-in-law, a cold, efficient young clerk named Rutherford Pruitt, Jr., who would not meet her eyes as he read the notice aloud. She and her children spent that first homeless month in the back room of the church, on the charity of Reverend Alden Cross, a kindly, threadbare man who fed them from his own thin larder and never once made her feel the shame she felt every hour of every day. Wyatt, 13 by then, took what work he could find at the livery, and Iris, only 9, grew quiet in a way that broke her mother's heart worse than any of the rest of it. It was in this state, homeless, humiliated, with $14 sewn into the hem of her one good dress, that Cora Mae stood at the edge of the crowd at the county courthouse steps, on a gray March morning, and watched the auctioneer call for bids on a parcel described only as one icehouse structure and a pertinent land, Miller's Creek, foreclosed, sold as is. The old Ashford Icehouse had stood at the bend of Miller's Creek for nearly 30 years, built in 1856 by a solitary, well-read man named Tobias Ashford, who had come to the valley before Sparrow Falls was even a proper town, and had made his modest fortune cutting river ice in winter, packing it in sawdust, and selling it through the hot months to every household and saloon for 20 miles. Ashford had also served, for a time, as the valley's unofficial land registrar and notary. In the years before the county courthouse was built, it was Ashford's neat hand that recorded who had filed what claim, who owed what debt, whose water rights ran where, because he was, by every account Cora Mae had ever heard, a scrupulously honest man in an era when such men were not always easy to find. He had died in 1876, alone and without heirs, and the Icehouse had passed through a tangle of estate proceedings before the bank, which had extended him a small loan against the property in his final year, quietly absorbed it and let it sit, forgotten, as the ice trade collapsed under the weight of the new railroad-borne manufactured ice from Butte. When Cora Mae raised her trembling hand and bid her last $9, the auctioneer's laugh was not cruel exactly, but it was not kind either. "You're buying rot and rats, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, not unkindly, as he took her money. "There's nothing in that old shed but sawdust and sorrow." She did not answer him. She only thought of her father, currycombing some sway-backed horse nobody else wanted, and she signed the paper. The Icehouse, when she and Wyatt first pushed open its groaning door, was every bit as bad as promised and worse. 30 years of neglect had rotted half the roof beams, and the spring runoff had turned the dirt floor to a black, sucking mud along the northern wall. But the deep central pit, the great sawdust-packed cavity where Ashford had once stored ice through entire summers, was still remarkably intact, insulated so well by decades of packed sawdust that when Cora Mae knelt at its edge on that first cold afternoon and dug her fingers experimentally into the material, she found, astonishingly, a solid, undisturbed mass of ancient ice, still frozen at its core, ice that must have been cut and packed away in the last winter before Tobias Ashford's death, sealed and forgotten for nearly 10 years. It was Wyatt who first noticed that the sawdust along the pit's northeastern corner sat differently than the rest, packed tighter, mounded slightly, as though someone had dug down and refilled it with more care than the natural settling of years would explain. Cora Mae might have dismissed it as nothing, might have been too exhausted and too heartsick that first week to think twice about a lump of sawdust in a ruined shed, but her father's old lesson rose up in her unbidden: never judge the worth of a thing by its condition on the outside, and so, more out of stubbornness than hope, she took up Daniel's old spade, the one relic of her husband's tools she had refused to sell even in the leanest days, and began, cautiously, to dig. 2 feet down, her spade struck something that was not ice and was not wood. It gave a dull, metallic knock that echoed strangely in the frozen hush of the Icehouse, and Cora Mae knelt in the cold sawdust with her bare hands and worked the rest of the material away, her breath clouding in the lantern light, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. What emerged, inch by careful inch, was a lead-lined chest, no larger than a bread box, its seams soldered shut with the kind of careful, deliberate craftsmanship that spoke of a man who had meant for this thing to survive damp, survive fire, survive years, survive perhaps even the man himself. There was no lock upon it, only the soldered seam, and a single word scratched crudely into the lead lid with what looked like the point of a nail: keep. She did not open it that first night. She was too afraid of what disappointment might do to the small, unfamiliar flicker of hope that had lit in her chest for the first time in a year, and afraid, too, in some deeper and less reasonable way, of what it might mean to disturb something a dead man had gone to such trouble to seal. She carried the chest back to the church in a burlap feed sack, hid it beneath her cot, and lay awake long into the night listening to her children's even breathing, turning the mystery over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by handling. It was Reverend Cross in the end who helped her open it, 3 days later, in the small tin-roofed shed behind the church that served as his tool room. He worked the soldered seam loose with a chisel and a patient hand, while Cora Mae stood by with her arms wrapped around herself, and when the lid finally came free with a small, sighing crack, what lay inside was not gold, though there was some gold, a modest pouch of coin, perhaps $200 in old eagles, wrapped in oilcloth, but something Cora Mae understood, even in that first stunned moment, was worth a great deal more than money. It was papers, dozens of them, folded and wrapped in waxed cloth, preserved by the cold and the dark as perfectly as the ice above them had been preserved. And bound among the papers, in the same neat, careful hand Cora Mae had heard described by old-timers as the finest in the valley, was a ledger, Tobias Ashford's own private ledger, kept in the years he had served as the valley's unofficial land registrar, recording claims filed, boundaries walked, water rights granted, debts owed and settled, family by family, year by year, from 1856 to the winter before his death in 1876. Reverend Cross read the first several pages aloud by lantern light while Cora Mae sat very still, and it was perhaps a quarter hour before either of them understood the shape of what they were holding. The ledger recorded, in Ashford's own careful hand, the original filed boundaries and water rights, for no fewer than 11 family claims along Miller's Creek and the surrounding valley. Claims that Cora Mae recognized, with a slow, creeping chill, as belonging to families whose land had, over the years since Ashford's death, quietly, and one by one, come under the control of the Vance and Pruitt Trust Company, absorbed through foreclosures the bank had always described as unavoidable, technical, regretful. Tucked among the ledger's pages were letters, too, several in Ashford's hand, unsent or perhaps copied and kept for his own protection, addressed to territorial land officials, raising quiet, careful concerns about irregularities he had observed in certain loan documents circulating through the valley, documents bearing a signature disturbingly similar to his own notary mark, on transactions he had no memory of ever witnessing. Cora Mae understood, sitting in that cold tool shed with the lantern guttering low, that she was holding evidence of something far larger and far older than her own misfortune, that the pattern which had claimed her own farm 2 years before had, if Ashford's careful suspicions were correct, been repeating itself quietly across the valley for 20 years, dressed up each time in the sober, regretful language of unavoidable business, while the man best positioned to notice the pattern, the valley's own honest notary, had been quietly gathering proof of it in his final years, and had died, suddenly, at only 54 years of age, with no formal diagnosis the town doctor of the time had ever put convincingly to paper, before he could act on what he knew. She did not sleep at all that night. And in the gray hour before dawn, sitting alone at the Reverend's small writing desk with Ashford's ledger open before her, Cora Mae Whitfield made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not sell the gold and disappear quietly to some other territory to start over, though God knew the thought crossed her mind, and no one who knew her hardship would have blamed her for it. She would find out, family by family, exactly what had been taken, from whom, and how, and she would see it returned. It took her the better part of 6 weeks, working in secret, to piece the fuller picture together, and she did not do it alone. She enlisted, first, old Simeon Katz, the valley's retired county surveyor, a stooped and half-deaf man who had walked every boundary line in the Miller's Creek Valley in his working years, and whose memory, though his hearing had failed him, remained sharp as a new-honed blade. Simeon confirmed, comparing Ashford's ledger against his own surviving field notes, that the original filed boundaries for at least 7 of the 11 families matched precisely what Ashford had recorded, and did not match the boundaries currently held on record at the county courthouse, where later filings, dated after Ashford's death and bearing what purported to be his notary seal, had quietly redrawn several water rights and acreage lines in ways that consistently, unfailingly, benefited land the Vance and Pruitt Trust Company either held outright or had extended loans against. She enlisted, too, a young lawyer newly arrived in Sparrow Falls named Josiah Blackwell, idealistic and hungry to make a name for himself, who agreed, for a modest share of nothing but her gratitude, to review the legal weight of what she had found and to quietly begin drafting the petitions such a discovery would require. Word, of course, could not stay contained forever in a town the size of Sparrow Falls, and it was Rutherford Pruitt Jr. himself, the same young clerk who had read Cora Mae her eviction notice 2 years before, who first noticed old Simeon Katz poring over county boundary records with unusual intensity and carried the news back to his uncle by marriage, Elias Vance. What followed was the hardest season of Cora Mae's life since Daniel's death, and in some ways harder, because grief, at least, asked nothing dishonest of her, while what Elias Vance attempted now asked her to doubt her own eyes. He came to her himself this time, no clerk sent in his place, arriving at the church in a fine buggy with an expression of wounded, avuncular concern, and suggested, gently, that a grieving widow, however resourceful, might easily mistake the confused papers of a lonely, aging bachelor for something more sinister than they were, that Tobias Ashford, God rest him, had in his final years been known to drink more than was wise and to grow suspicious of shadows, and that it would be a terrible thing, wouldn't it, for Cora Mae to drag his good name and the bank's good name through the mud of a dead man's confused scribbling, only to see herself humiliated before the whole valley when the county's own official records the bank had, of course, nothing to do with maintaining, proved him wrong. When gentleness did not move her, Vance's tone shifted, over the following weeks, into something colder. He let it be known, through channels that never quite traced back to him directly, that the Whitfield woman was stirring up trouble that could hurt every family in the valley who held a note with the bank, should the bank's confidence be shaken. He had the local newspaper, whose owner carried his own debt to the trust, run a small item questioning the wild claims of a destitute widow grasping for gold at a dead man's expense. And he had Rutherford Pruitt Jr. quietly visit 3 of the 11 affected families to remind them, with great sympathetic regret, how easily a bank under strain might be forced to call in other outstanding notes, should unfounded rumors continue to circulate and frighten depositors. It was in this pressed and uncertain season, with 2 of the 11 families growing frightened enough to ask Cora Mae to simply let the matter drop, that Cora Mae Whitfield came closest to giving up entirely, not from any failure of conviction about what she had found, but from the exhausting, grinding weight of standing nearly alone against a man who had spent 20 years building a reputation for warmth and trustworthiness in the very town now being asked to doubt him. She remembered, in the worst of those nights, her father's other saying, less often repeated, but no less true, that a fine horse, broken poorly by a cruel hand, will sometimes flinch even from a kind one, for a long while, before it learns to trust again, and that the breaking of that fear takes patience, not force. She understood, turning the thought over, that the valley's fear of Vance would not be broken by her outrage alone. It would need proof, so plain, so undeniable, that even frightened people could not look away from it. The proof, when it finally came together, came from an unexpected source. Simeon Katz's old survey chain and compass, still hanging in his barn, and a patient, painstaking week in which Cora Mae, Wyatt, now 15, and strong enough to hold a chain steady across a half-mile of rough creek bottom, and old Simeon himself, walked every disputed boundary line in the valley by hand, driving fresh stakes at the exact points Ashford's ledger described, and photographing each stake, with a borrowed camera and glass plates, standing beside the county's later redrawn markers, so that any person with eyes could see the 2 lines did not match, and see, too, that the later markers sat conveniently, suspiciously, always in favor of trust-held land. Josiah Blackwell, meanwhile, had located, through a contact at the territorial capital, the original notary registration Tobias Ashford had filed in 1856, complete with an exemplar of his true seal and signature, and set beside the seal used on the disputed later filings. Even an untrained eye could see the forger's hand had pressed the stamp at a subtly different angle, worn a fraction differently at one edge, a discrepancy so small it had escaped notice for years, and so plain, once pointed out, that it could never again be unseen. Cora Mae called for a public meeting at the schoolhouse on a warm evening in late June of 1885, and word of what she intended to present had spread widely enough, despite Vance's best efforts, that better than 200 people crowded into a room built for 80, spilling out the open windows into the summer dusk. Elias Vance came too, seated near the front with Rutherford Pruitt Jr. at his side, his expression composed into an easy, patient smile that Cora Mae, standing before the room in her one good dress with Tobias Ashford's ledger open on the schoolmaster's desk before her, recognized now for exactly what her own father had named it years before, a man smiling with his mouth open too wide, already counting teeth. She did not shout. She did not accuse, not directly, not at first. She simply told the room the story as she had lived it. The eviction, the icehouse, the ice, the sawdust, the chest-marked keep. And then she let Simeon Katz's photograph speak, passed hand to hand through the crowded room, each family recognizing with a slow, dawning horror the true original boundary of land they had believed. For years, they had simply, honestly, lost. She let Josiah Blackwell explain, in plain terms any farmer could follow, the discrepancy in the notary seal, and when Elias Vance rose, as she had known he would, to protest that this was nothing more than the desperate fabrication of papers by a woman with every motive to invent a fortune for herself, Cora Mae reached into her basket and produced the final piece of the mystery, a bundle of letters, in Ashford's own hand, that Reverend Cross had helped her transcribe and verify against samples of Ashford's known correspondence held by the church itself. Letters written to territorial land officials in the year before his death, describing his growing suspicion that someone with access to his notary stamp, a stamp he had, in one letter, noted with quiet unease, had gone briefly missing from his office in the winter of 1875, at a time when, town records showed, a young Elias Vance had newly arrived in the valley and taken temporary lodging, by unhappy coincidence, in rooms directly above Ashford's own small office. The silence that followed in the schoolhouse was, Cora Mae would say for the rest of her life, the loudest sound she ever heard. Elias Vance did not shout either. He simply grew very still and very pale, and it was in that stillness, more than in any single piece of evidence laid before the room, that 200 people watched 20 years of careful reputation crack open like the sawdust-packed ice in the old Ashford Icehouse, revealing, at last, what had been sealed inside all along. Justice in the end came quietly, as justice in a small territorial valley in 1885 most often did. There was no dramatic arrest, no gunfight, no chase. Only a territorial land commissioner summoned from the capital, a careful review of Simeon Katz's photographs and Josiah Blackwell's documents that took the better part of 2 months, and, at the end of it, a formal restoration of the original 1856 boundaries to all 11 affected families, funded in significant part by a settlement the Vance and Pruitt Trust Company was compelled, under threat of a fraud prosecution that would have ruined it entirely, to pay from its own reserves. Thomas Pruitt, the bank's other founder, who had known nothing of his partner's forgeries and was as stunned as anyone in that schoolhouse, moved quickly and publicly to distance himself, cooperated fully with the commissioner, and in time reorganized the institution under his name alone, instituting, at Josiah Blackwell's insistence, a public land title verification process open to any family who wished to check their deed against Ashford's ledger, which Cora Mae donated, with the town's blessing, to the new county archive. Elias Vance himself quietly forfeited his share of the bank, paid what restitution the commissioner ordered, and left the valley before the first snow of that year, and Sparrow Falls, in the way of small towns everywhere, spoke of him afterward only in low voices and past tense, a man who had smiled too wide for too long. The Whitfield farm on Miller's Creek was restored to Cora Mae as part of the settlement, its original note declared void from the moment the acceleration clause was shown to rest on documentation the commissioner found irregular, and she moved her children home that autumn, planting the first of what would become, over the following years, a modest but thriving apiary in her mother's old tradition, alongside her dairy herd, rebuilt cow by cow, with the help of neighbors who no longer merely tipped their hats to her, but stopped to talk, to thank her, to bring their children by, simply to meet the woman who had found a fortune in an icehouse and given nearly all of it away. And so it was that a woman who had once stood at the courthouse steps with $14 sewn into her hem, laughed at gently for spending her last $9 on a rotting shed full of sawdust and rats, became instead the reason 11 families slept easy in homes that were, at last, truly and rightfully their own. Cora Mae Whitfield never forgot the lesson her father taught her, currycombing some sway-backed horse nobody else wanted. That the worth of a thing is rarely written plainly on its surface. That patience and a willingness to look past rot and ruin will, more often than the world admits, uncover something worth keeping. She had bought an Icehouse for $9 believing, as everyone around her believed, that she was buying nothing but her own foolishness. What she found beneath the ice was not merely gold, though there was gold enough to matter. It was proof, patiently preserved through a decade of silence by a good man who could not save himself but had refused to let the truth die with him, and it was the chance, which Cora Mae took with both hands, to be the one who finally, faithfully, kept it. We hope Cora Mae's story reminded you, as it reminds us every time we tell it, that value hides in the most unlikely places, and that patience and honest hands can uncover what greed and cruelty spent years trying to bury. If this story moved you, we'd be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a little reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often turn out to matter more than anyone guessed. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and for letting Cora Mae's story sit with you a while. Until next time, stay close.